The gun was already drawn when Yates Galloway walked back into the Silver Spur saloon, and every man in the room went quiet the way men go quiet when they know somebody is about to die. "I thought I told you to ride out," said Cole Drummond, the barrel of his revolver aimed square at Yates's chest. Drummond was Harlan Voss's top enforcer, a man with a reputation that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Montana border and was built entirely on the suffering of people smaller than himself. "I thought I told you this town doesn't want your kind of trouble." Yates did not reach for his weapon. He stood in the doorway with the last orange light of evening cutting through the dust behind him, and his eyes moved past Drummond to the woman standing behind the bar. Her name was Grace Prout. She had her hands pressed flat against the bar top as if she were trying to keep the whole world from tilting sideways, and the bruise along her left jaw was fresh enough to still be swelling. "You hit her," Yates said. It was not a question. Drummond adjusted his aim. "Last warning, Galloway. Mount up and ride out of Ridge Creek before I put you in the ground. Mr. Voss doesn't appreciate—" "You hit her," Yates said again, and this time his voice had changed. It had gone somewhere low and quiet and utterly without mercy. The room exhaled. 3 of Drummond's men were positioned along the far wall. The piano player had stopped. The cards on the poker table sat abandoned. Every soul in the Silver Spur knew they were witnessing something that could not be taken back. A line being crossed in the red dirt of consequence. A moment that would divide the story of this small Colorado town into before and after. What none of them knew, not yet, was how Yates Galloway had come to be standing in Ridge Creek in the first place. They did not know what had brought him down out of the high country with his horse half dead, and a month-old wound still pulling at the skin along his ribs. They did not know that he had intended to pass through without stopping, without looking, without letting a single living soul get close enough to matter. That had been his intention. It had lasted until the second morning, when he had seen Grace Prout haul 3 50-pound flour sacks off the back of a delivery wagon entirely by herself in the summer heat, refuse help from every man who offered it, and then go back inside the bakery. She ran on the corner of Main and 2nd, and emerged 15 minutes later with 2 loaves of bread wrapped in cloth for old Ezra Hawthorne, who everybody in town knew had nothing left to his name. That had been 6 weeks ago. And Yates Galloway, who had been moving fast and alone his entire adult life, had not yet managed to leave. It had started the way most things in his life started, not with a plan, but with a horse. The horse had thrown a shoe somewhere in the rocky stretch of high terrain north of Ridge Creek, and Yates had walked the animal down into town on a July morning when the heat was already punishing, and the sky was the particular white-blue that meant more of the same. He had been riding a circuit of rough country for 3 years, working odd jobs and moving before anyone could develop the kind of expectations that required him to stay. He was 29 years old and had been living without roots since he was 17, and he had come to believe that rootlessness was simply his nature. Ridge Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1882, was the kind of town that looked temporary from a distance. It was perched in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, surrounded by ranching country, and it survived on the commerce generated by a handful of large cattle operations and the needs of the families who worked them. It had a general store, a blacksmith, the Silver Spur saloon, a small church, a doctor's office, a livery, a tiny schoolhouse, and Grace Prout's bakery, which also served as an informal gathering place for the women of the town and, on certain mornings, anyone who needed somewhere to sit quietly and be handed something warm without being asked to explain themselves. The blacksmith's name was Frank Odell, and he was a fair man who told Yates straight off that he could have the horse reshod by noon, but that the animal's right foreleg was showing some strain that warranted a few days of rest and light work. "We've got a livery on Copper Street," Odell said, not looking up from the hoof he was examining. "Decent hay. Reasonable rate." Yates paid for 3 days in advance, which was his way of committing to nothing, and went looking for somewhere to sleep that was not a saloon floor. What he found was a small boarding house run by a widow named Harriet Kell, who charged him 50 cents a night and informed him that breakfast was included, but that she would not be held responsible for mending any clothing that arrived in the condition his currently was. He had laughed at that, which surprised him, because he had not laughed genuinely in longer than he could recall. He ate breakfast the next morning at the long table in Harriet's dining room along with 2 traveling salesmen and a quiet cattle drover named Amos Webb. And afterward, he walked the length of Main Street simply because he had nowhere else to be. He was passing the bakery when the delivery wagon arrived, and he stopped, and he watched Grace Prout move those flour sacks with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that waiting for help was a strategy for disappointment. She was 26. He learned this later, but in that first moment he simply saw a woman of medium height with dark brown hair pinned back under a calico work cap, flour already dusting her forearms, moving with a kind of physical authority that he found unexpectedly compelling. She worked quickly and without wasted motion, and when she finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and looked up and found him watching. "You going to stand there all morning, or were you planning to buy something?" she said, not unkindly, but direct in the way that told him she had no time for performances. "What would you recommend?" he said. "Sourdough. I put dried rosemary in it. Most men think they don't want that, and then they eat half a loaf standing at the counter." He went inside and bought a loaf of sourdough with dried rosemary. He ate most of it standing at the counter just as she had predicted, and she pretended not to notice. And that was the first exchange between Yates Galloway and Grace Prout, which was not romantic in any way that either of them would have recognized at the time, but which, in retrospect, contained everything that followed. He stayed the 3 days for the horse. Then he found a few days of work helping a rancher named Beaumont clear fence line on a stretch of land south of town, and he stayed for that. Then he helped Frank Odell for a week when Odell's apprentice left suddenly for California, and he stayed for that. The days accumulated the way days do when a man stops counting them, not because he has decided to stay, but because he has simply stopped deciding to leave. He came to the bakery most mornings. This was easy to justify as practical, because Grace made the best coffee in Ridge Creek, and the only biscuits worth eating within 40 miles. And it was not necessary to examine the fact that he sat at the table nearest the window through which he could watch both the street and the counter with equal convenience. He was a man who had stayed alive by watching, and watching was simply what he did. What he had not accounted for was how much he would learn simply by being present. Grace Prout had come to Ridge Creek 4 years earlier with her husband, a man named Thomas Prout, who had intended to start a cattle operation, and had instead contracted typhoid fever and died in the spring of 1880, leaving Grace with the bakery they had opened together, a small house 2 streets behind Maine, $12, and no family within 600 miles. She had stayed because leaving would have required resources she didn't have, and because she had looked at the town around her and decided, with the particular stubbornness that Yates would come to recognize as the most defining feature of her character, that she was not going to let circumstance define the boundaries of what she could build. She had rebuilt, not just survived. The bakery was hers, genuinely and entirely hers, in a way that Thomas's original enterprise had never been. She knew every customer by name and remembered their preferences and their family situations and their bad days. She extended credit quietly to families going through hard times and never mentioned it again. She had become, in the understated way of small towns, essential. She was also in trouble. Yates recognized this before anyone told him about it, because he had spent 12 years in rough country reading situations, and Ridge Creek had the particular texture of a place in the early stages of being squeezed. Harlan Voss had arrived in the valley the previous autumn. He was a land speculator and cattleman of the predatory variety, the kind that bought leverage before he bought land and understood that in a remote Colorado town, the law was only as present as the nearest federal marshal, and the nearest federal marshal was a very long distance away. He had already acquired 3 of the smaller ranches through a combination of debt pressure and carefully manufactured legal disputes. He wanted the land along the valley's main water source, Ridge Creek itself, because whoever controlled the water controlled everything else. Grace's bakery sat on a parcel that fronted a secondary street running parallel to the creek, and the building itself was not what Voss wanted. What he wanted was the easement on her property that would allow him to run a pipe diversion without going through the public land at the center of town, which would have required permits and attention from territorial authorities. He had been trying to buy the easement from her for 3 months. She had declined every time with a politeness that did not conceal the fact that she understood exactly what he was trying to do. This was why Cole Drummond had been leaning on her. Not dramatically, not yet, but steadily, in the way that water finds weakness. Small things. The delivery from the flour mill in Durango had been delayed twice in ways that seemed coincidental until they happened a third time. A rumor had started circulating, the origin impossible to trace, suggesting that her bookkeeping was irregular. 2 of her regular morning customers had stopped coming without explanation. The kind of pressure that was hard to name and harder to fight, designed to wear a person down to the point where the offered price for the easement started looking like relief rather than surrender. Yates had been piecing this together for weeks. He had not said anything to Grace about it, both because he was not entirely sure he was right, and because he was aware, with an uncomfortable clarity, that his interest in her situation was not entirely objective. He had stopped pretending that he came to the bakery solely for the coffee around the 3rd week. He had stopped pretending that she was merely an interesting person around the 4th. By the 5th, he was simply engaged in a quiet and increasingly frustrating argument with himself about the nature of his intentions and the wisdom of having any. Grace was not unaware of him. She was, in fact, acutely aware of him in the way you become acutely aware of something that is present every day and makes no demands and offers a steady warmth that you have trained yourself not to depend on. She had spent 2 years after Thomas's death carefully maintaining her self-sufficiency in all its forms, emotional included, because she had learned the hard way what it cost to organize your world around another person's continued presence. She watched Yates the way she watched the weather. Not anxiously, but with attention, noting the patterns. He arrived between 7 and 8 in the morning. He drank 2 cups of coffee, black. He ate whatever she put in front of him without commentary, though she noticed he ate more enthusiastically on the mornings she made the rosemary sourdough. He read the Durango newspaper when she had one, which was irregular, and when she did not have one he sat and watched the street with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to turn patience into a skill rather than endure it as a limitation. He asked her questions. Not personal ones, not at first. About the history of the valley, about the families who had been there longest, about the water situation and the grazing rights and the disputes that Voss was generating. She answered him because the questions were intelligent, and because she recognized, with some instinct she could not fully name, that he was asking for reasons that were not neutral. "Why are you still here?" she asked him one morning in his 4th week. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, not stalling but actually thinking. "Not sure yet," he said, which was the honest answer, and she accepted it as such because honesty, even when it was incomplete, was something she had learned to value above comfortable reassurance. She learned about his background gradually, the way you learn the terrain of a place you're walking through slowly, one feature at a time. He had grown up in eastern Kansas, the third of 5 children of a farming family that had lost its land to drought and bank foreclosure when he was 16. He had drifted south and then west, working cattle drives and then, for a period he mentioned without elaboration, working for a man in New Mexico whose business interests Yates described simply as complicated, and whose employ he had left when it became clear that the complication was the kind that accumulated bodies. He had acquired his reputation with a gun during this period, not by seeking it out but by surviving several situations in which the alternative to being good with a gun was being dead. He did not speak of it with pride or with shame, simply as fact. He was careful with firearms the way a man is careful with tools he understands thoroughly, and he carried his revolver on his right hip with the low-slung ease of long practice. He had been moving since then, 3 years of honest work and cautious living, and the persistent inability to find a reason to stop anywhere permanently. He had not, he told her, been looking for a reason. He had believed, and was in the process of reevaluating this belief, that looking was itself a kind of weakness. "That's not weakness," she said. "That's just a thing you tell yourself so the loneliness doesn't feel like a choice." He looked at her for a long moment across the bakery counter and said nothing. What he was thinking was that she was the most direct person he had ever encountered, and that directness, after years of navigating people's hidden motives and complicated angles, was so startling and so welcome that it felt like a kind of physical relief. What she was thinking was that she had said too much, and that the way he was looking at her was doing something to her equilibrium that she had promised herself she would not allow. The tension between them was of the slow building, carefully avoided variety that is in some ways more acute than the dramatic kind, because there is no event to attach it to, and therefore no clear way to resolve it. It existed in the space between words, and in the fact that he remembered, without being told, that she preferred her coffee with a small amount of honey on the mornings when she was tired, and in the way she always found a reason to stay behind the counter when he was in the bakery, as if the counter were a border she had drawn for her own protection. The situation with Voss escalated at the start of his 6th week. Yates heard about it from Amos Webb, the drover from Harriet Kell's boarding house, who had it from the livery operator, who had been present when Drummond came to the bakery the previous afternoon, and made a suggestion that was dressed in polite language but was not polite. Drummond had told Grace that Mr. Voss's patience was not inexhaustible, and that there were ways for a woman alone to find herself without the protections she had come to rely on. When Yates arrived at the bakery the next morning, Grace was already there, as she always was, but the set of her jaw was different. She moved around the kitchen with slightly too much force, the way people move when they are using physical activity to manage something internal. "Tell me about the easement," he said, setting down his coffee cup. She turned around from the bread she was scoring. "What did you hear?" "Enough." She was quiet for a moment, and then she sat down across from him at the small table by the window for the first time in 6 weeks of mornings, which meant she had decided to stop pretending he was just a customer She told him about Voss, about the easement, about the months of quiet pressure and what Drummond had said the previous afternoon. "He didn't touch you," Yates said. It was half question, half statement. "No," a pause. "Not yet." The not yet hung in the air between them. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What are my options?" he said. "You could sell the easement." "I could," she said. "And then he has the water, and every family along that creek is at his mercy. I know what he'll do with it. He'll squeeze them out one by one until he owns everything in this valley." "Yes," Yates agreed. "He will, so that's not an option." "No," he said. "I didn't think so." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I want to be clear about that. This is not me asking you to solve my problem. I know that. Then why are you still sitting there with that look on your face?" "What look?" "The one that means you've already decided something." He had. But he needed a few more days to understand exactly what he had decided and why. Because the what was simple. Drummond needed to be dealt with, and Voss needed to understand that his strategy had reached a limit. But the why was complicated in ways he was still working through. The thing he had been refusing to examine directly for 6 weeks was now refusing to remain unexamined. He was still in Ridge Creek because of Grace Prout, not because of her situation, not because of some abstract principle of justice, though both of those things were real and true. He was there because of the particular gravity she had, the way she moved through the world without apology and without flinching, the way she could take a piece of dough and turn it into something people needed and wanted, the way she had looked at him in those first weeks with a complete absence of the calculation he was accustomed to encountering. He was there because she had told him, without meaning to, that loneliness was a choice. And for the first time in 3 years, he was sitting with the possibility that she was right. He went to see Roy Tanner the following morning. Tanner was Ridge Creek's town marshal, a capable man in most respects who was operating under a specific disability. Voss had extended him a personal loan the previous winter when Tanner's wife had needed a doctor for a difficult birth, and the debt was being called in as leverage. Tanner was not a corrupt man. He was a trapped one, which is a different and in some ways worse thing, because a corrupt man has at least made a choice, while a trapped man is simply suffering. Yates understood this situation because he had been in adjacent ones. He sat across from Tanner in the small marshal's office and laid out what he knew about Voss's operation, not accusatorially but methodically, the way you lay out information for someone who already knows most of it and needs permission to act on it. "I can't go against Voss directly," Tanner said. "You understand my position." "I understand it," Yates said, "but I need to know that if I move on Drummond, you're not going to stand in the way." Tanner looked at him for a long time. "Drummond's been looking for a reason to put you in the ground since the day you got here." "I know that." "What makes you think you'd come out of it?" "I don't know that I will," Yates said honestly. "But I know Grace Prout is standing in the way of something powerful, and she's standing there alone, and that's not right." Tanner was quiet. Then he said, "I won't stand in the way. But I can't be the one who starts it. I'm not asking you to be." He went from Tanner's office to the Silver Spur, where he had heard Drummond spend his afternoons, and he found Drummond at the bar with 2 of his men and told him, in front of 8 witnesses, that his business with the Prout property was concluded, and that any further pressure on Grace or her establishment would be answered personally. Drummond had smiled at this, the dangerous smile of a man who has never encountered a consequence he couldn't outrun, and told Yates that he had until sundown to leave Ridge Creek or find out how permanent the arrangements in this valley could be. Yates rode out to the Beaumont Ranch and spent the afternoon there, partly because he had told Sam Beaumont he would help with a section of fence, and partly because physical work was the best way he knew to think clearly. He worked through the afternoon with Beaumont's ranch hand, a good-natured young man named Illy, and they strung wire and set posts in the clean summer air while Yates turned the situation in his mind the way you turn a stone to find the stable side. He was not afraid of Drummond. This was a fact about himself he accepted without vanity, because fear was simply information, and the information he was receiving about Cole Drummond was that the man was powerful within the specific context of a town that had decided it could not protect itself. Remove that context and Drummond was a man with a gun and a set of instructions, and Yates had been dealing with that combination his entire adult life. What he was worried about was what happened after. If he dealt with Drummond and Voss responded by bringing in more men, which was likely, then Grace would be in a worse position than before unless the situation's structure changed. He needed Voss to lose more than a confrontation. He needed Voss to lose the leverage. He sat with Beaumont on the porch that evening and laid out the water rights situation. And Beaumont, who was a third-generation rancher with a thorough understanding of both Colorado water law and the long-term consequences of ceding control of a valley's water source, listened carefully and then said, "What you're describing is an illegal diversion. The Territorial Water Board would be very interested in that. Would they act on it? If someone filed a complaint and sent the right documentation to Denver, yes. The territorial authorities have been looking for a reason to rein Voss in for a year. He's made powerful enemies up north." Who would file the complaint? Beaumont looked at him with the slow smile of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. "I've been wanting to file that complaint for 6 months. I just needed someone to stand between me and Drummond's guns while I did it." Yates rode back to town with a clearer picture. He had one more conversation to have before the rest of it could proceed. He found Grace that evening, not at the bakery but at her house on the quiet street behind Main, where she was watering the small kitchen garden she kept along the south wall. The sun was getting low and the light was the color of warm copper, and she did not hear him coming until he was at the gate, at which point she turned and looked at him with an expression that was relieved and wary in equal measure. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I would be." She set down her watering can. "What happened today?" He told her about Tanner, about Drummond at the Silver Spur, about his conversation with Beaumont and the territorial complaint. She listened without interrupting, her arms folded, her face very still in the way he had come to recognize as her most focused mode of attention. When he finished, she said, "Drummond isn't going to just accept that." "No," he said, "he's not. So he'll come looking for you." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, and the only sound was the wind moving the dry grass beyond the garden wall and somewhere down the street, a dog going through its evening announcement. Then she said, "Why are you doing this, Yates?" He had been preparing a practical answer, something about justice and water rights and the long-term stability of the valley's smaller landholders. But she was looking at him with the directness that was her defining quality, and he had learned enough about her by now to know that she would recognize a practical answer for the deflection it was. "Because I can't leave until I know you're going to be all right," he said. "And that surprised me. Because I've been leaving places my whole life without looking back, and I didn't think anything could make that different." She held his gaze for what felt like a very long time. "Yates, I know," he said. "I know this isn't. I didn't say it wasn't something," she said. "I said your name." He understood then that she was not correcting him. She was simply making space in the conversation for what both of them were managing. The fact that something real had grown in the ordinary container of mornings and coffee and sourdough bread, and that neither of them had entirely known how to hold it. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't been paying attention," she said. "I've been paying close attention, Probably too close. I don't think it's possible to pay too close attention to the right things. She looked away then toward the garden, and he watched her decide something. When she looked back, her expression had opened. The careful guard she maintained relaxed in a way he had not seen before. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee and you can tell me the rest of the plan." He went inside, and she made coffee, and they sat at the small table in her kitchen with the last daylight coming through the window. And he told her the rest of it, and she added details and corrections, and twice identified assumptions he had made that were incorrect and needed adjustment. She knew this town and its people and its dynamics far better than he did, and working through it together produced something substantially better than what he had arrived with. It was late when he left. Standing at her gate in the dark, she said, "Be careful tomorrow." "I will. I mean it." A pause. "There are very few people in this town I would say that to and mean it the way I mean it to you." He understood what she was saying. He said, "I'll be back for coffee in the morning." "You better be," she said, and went inside. He was there in the morning. And Drummond came to the Silver Spur around noon, and sent word that Yates needed to come and answer for his behavior of the day before, which was the moment the story opened. The loaded gun, and the silent room, and the bruise along Grace's jaw that told Yates everything he needed to know about what kind of morning she had already had. What happened next was fast, and then slow, and then fast again, the way serious things happen. Yates walked into the room with his hands empty and his eyes taking in the whole picture. Drummond and his revolver, the three men along the wall, the bartender who was standing very still, Grace behind the bar with her hands flat, and her breathing controlled in a way that suggested she was keeping herself together through sheer will. "Your business with Miss Prout is done," Yates said to Drummond. "Whatever Mr. Voss is paying you to do here, it's done." "That's not how Mr. Voss sees it," Drummond said. "I know, but the Territorial Water Board in Denver sees it differently. They've been seeing it differently for about 4 hours now, since Sam Beaumont sent a rider with a formal complaint and documentation of the illegal diversion Voss has been planning. Something shifted in the room. Not visibly, not the way weather shifts, but in the quality of the attention. Drummond was a professional, and professionals process new information. "You're lying," Drummond said. "Check Beaumont's stable. His fastest horse is missing and his best rider left before dawn. You can confirm it in about 3 days when the federal authorities arrive." Drummond held the aim for another 3 seconds and then lowered the gun, which was the choice of a man who was calculating rather than acting on pure aggression. He said, "This isn't over, Galloway." "That's between you and Mr. Voss," Yates said, "but it's over with her." Drummond left. His men followed. The room exhaled, and then the sound came back into it gradually, the way sound returns to a place after a shock has passed. Yates walked to the bar. Grace was looking at him with an expression that contained too many things to separate. He reached across the bar and very gently touched the bruised side of her jaw, barely contact, just enough to ask the question. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. "Who hit you, Drummond, this morning?" I told him the answer was still no, and he wanted to make sure I understood the cost of that answer. "He won't come back," Yates said. "You're certain of that?" "I'm certain of the water board. The rest follows." Roy Tanner appeared in the doorway of the saloon at this point, having heard the noise from the street, or perhaps having been watching from a nearby position and timing his entrance, which was also possible. He looked at Yates and at Grace and at the room full of people who were already talking, and he said, "I suppose I missed something." "Drummond left town," Yates said. "Voluntarily." Tanner looked at him for a moment. "Uh-huh." He looked at Grace. "You all right, Miss Prout?" "I will be," she said. Tanner looked at Yates again, the long, careful look of a man who has been living in a corner and is reevaluating the dimensions of it. "Beaumont really send that rider?" "He really did." Tanner nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and walked out. It was not a large word, but the way he said it contained a year's worth of frustration and relief, and the particular freedom of a man who has just watched someone else do the thing he wished he could have done himself. The next several days had the quality of aftermath, the careful examination of damage and the cataloging of what it held. Voss did not ride into town immediately. His men were present, visible, watching, but the aggressive forward pressure had stopped, and Yates read this correctly as Voss processing the changed situation and deciding whether to fight or absorb. A man like Voss did not become as powerful as he had become by making emotional decisions. He would be calculating. Beaumont's rider reached Denver in 2.5 days, and the response was faster than Yates had expected, which suggested that Beaumont's assessment of Voss's standing with territorial authorities had been accurate. A letter arrived via the next stagecoach from Durango acknowledging receipt of the complaint, and indicating that a territorial water inspector would be dispatched within 3 weeks. When this news circulated in Ridge Creek, the atmosphere shifted in the specific way it shifts when people who have been afraid realize the object of their fear has a vulnerability. Conversations that had been held in low voices grew louder. The ranchers who had been losing ground to Voss's legal maneuvers found a lawyer in Durango and began consulting him. Roy Tanner came to see Yates and said that 2 of Drummond's remaining men had ridden out the previous night, and that Drummond himself had apparently not returned to Voss's main property, but had simply kept going, which made a certain kind of sense for a man whose value had just been significantly reduced. Through all of this, Yates continued coming to the bakery each morning. The situation had changed, but the mornings had not, and he was aware, in the most alert part of himself, that this was significant. The crisis had passed, or at least reduced to something manageable, and he was still there, and not because there was fence to clear or a blacksmith who needed help. He was there because of the woman who handed him coffee and sourdough, bread, and talked to him about the valley and the customers and the books she was reading, and occasionally, with the careful indirectness of someone who is moving towards something and knows it, about herself. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the youngest of 4 children of a minister and his wife who ran a tight, principled household that she had loved and eventually outgrown. She had come west with Thomas because he had a dream she had believed in, and because she had wanted the kind of life that required you to build something. She did not speak of Thomas with grief exactly, more with the complicated tenderness of someone who has processed a loss thoroughly enough to understand it clearly. She had loved him, and his death had devastated her, and she had been rebuilt by her own hands into something that was still recognizably her but stronger in the places where it had cracked. "You miss him?" Yates asked her one morning, not intrusively but because he genuinely wanted to understand the landscape of her interior. She thought about it honestly. "I miss the life we were building together. I miss having someone who was invested in what I was doing. I miss—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. Companionship. Not just company, but the specific kind of companionship where someone knows the whole of what you're trying to do and cares whether you succeed. She looked at him across the table. "I haven't missed it abstractly for a while," she said. "That's the most honest answer I can give you." He understood what she was saying. He held it carefully, because it was fragile in the way honest things are fragile, and he did not want to move too fast and damage it. What he felt was difficult to name with the precision he would have liked, because his experience of emotional attachment had been limited and largely cautious, and had never included someone quite like Grace. She was simultaneously the most capable person he had encountered in a long time, and the person who made him feel most clearly what it meant to want to be present for someone's life. Not to rescue her, she had made abundantly clear she did not need rescuing, but to be there in the everyday sense, the morning coffee and the quiet conversation and the accumulated ordinary moments that were, he was beginning to understand, the actual substance of a life rather than its interruptions. He told her things he had not said to anyone, not in 12 years of moving through the world. About Kansas and the farm, and the particular quality of loss that comes when you watch your family's security stripped away by forces that have no face and no conscience. About New Mexico and the man he had worked for, and the moment he understood that he had been moving toward a line he would not be able to cross without losing something essential about himself. About the years after and the specific loneliness of choosing freedom over belonging when you cannot find a belonging that is honest. "You've been waiting for something worth staying for," she said. "I didn't think I was waiting," he said. "I thought I was just moving. Same thing sometimes." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a small gesture, but between two people who had been carefully maintaining an appropriate distance for 6 weeks, it was enormous, and they both knew it. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat there in the quiet bakery with the morning light coming through the windows, and the smell of bread baking, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things are clearer without words. Harlan Voss came to town 10 days after the writer went to Denver. He came alone, which Yates had not expected and which turned out to be significant. He was a large man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and been worn into something harder by years of calculating rather than feeling. He came to the bakery, which was also not what Yates had expected. Yates was there when Voss arrived, which was either fortunate or the result of the fact that he had been alert enough to half expect something. He was at the table by the window when the door opened and Voss walked in, and he was on his feet and standing at a careful angle before Voss had reached the counter. "Miss Prout," Voss said. His voice was measured, the voice of a man who had learned to use civility as a tool. "I wanted to speak with you directly, without intermediaries." Grace looked at him steadily. "Mr. Voss." He did not look at Yates. He placed his hands on the counter in a deliberate gesture of openness, the way a man puts down a weapon to demonstrate goodwill. "I have come to the conclusion that my approach to the easement matter has been handled with less care than the situation warranted. I believe some of the methods employed on my behalf were inappropriate." "Was Mr. Drummond's fist inappropriate?" Yates said. Voss looked at him then. "Mr. Galloway, I am not speaking to you." "No," Yates said, "but Miss Prout is, and she's under no obligation to hear your version of events without someone present who knows the full version." Voss held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Grace. "I am prepared to withdraw all interest in the easement. In exchange, I'm asking that no further complaints be filed and that the existing complaint be formally withdrawn." Grace said, "And the families you've pressured out of their land, the Harkins property and the Wheeler spread." Voss blinked. This was not a question he had prepared for, which meant he had underestimated her. "That is a separate matter," he said. "It's the same matter," she said. "It's the same pattern of behavior and the same method. If you want me to withdraw the water complaint, I'll need more than the easement off the table." There was a silence. Yates watched Voss recalibrate. The man was smart enough to understand that he was standing in a bakery talking to a woman who was not operating from fear and had not been for some time, and that his usual tools were not functioning correctly. "What would you need?" Voss said. Fair market value for the Harkins and Wheeler properties, paid to the families you pressured out, and you ride out of this valley. Voss was quiet for a long time. He looked at Grace, then at Yates, then at the space between them that contained something he could not quite categorize but clearly registered. "You've organized this town," he said to Grace, not accusatorially, almost with a kind of surprised respect. "The town was always organized," she said. "You just assumed otherwise." Voss left without agreeing to anything, but Yates had watched enough negotiations to know when a man was going to come back with what he'd been asked for. The leverage was all on the other side, and Voss was smart enough to cut his losses cleanly. He was right. 3 days later, Voss sent a letter through his lawyer in Durango agreeing to the terms. The Harkins family received a check. The Wheelers, who had left the valley for New Mexico, were tracked down and paid. Voss sold his remaining Ridge Creek holdings at a loss and redirected his attention to another part of the territory where his reputation had not yet caught up with him. Roy Tanner came to the bakery the morning the letter arrived and sat at the counter and accepted a cup of coffee from Grace with the sheepish air of a man who has a lot to account for and does not know where to start. "I know I didn't help the way I should have," he said. "You were trapped," Grace said simply, "and you made the right choice when it counted." "Galloway made the right choice," Tanner said. He looked at Yates. "I owe you." "You owe the town," Yates said. "Pay it to them." Tanner nodded, and Yates believed he meant it, and that was enough. The day after Voss's letter arrived was a Sunday, and Grace did not open the bakery on Sundays. She came to find Yates instead, which reversed the pattern of their mornings and felt meaningful in a way that neither of them commented on directly. She found him at Harriet Kell's boarding house, sitting on the porch with coffee, and she sat in the chair beside him, and they watched the Sunday quiet of the street together. "He's really gone," she said. "He is." She was quiet for a moment. "So your reason for staying is resolved?" He turned to look at her. "Is that what you think I'm asking?" "The practical reason is resolved," he said. "The actual reason is sitting in the chair next to me." She looked at him with the steady directness that was the quality he had loved first, even before he was ready to call it love. "You said once that you'd been leaving places your whole life and nothing had made that different. That's true." "What's different now?" "You are," he said. "And I am in this place, which I didn't expect. I feel like myself here in a way I haven't felt like myself anywhere in a long time." She reached over and took his hand, which she had been doing with increasing ease over the preceding weeks, and said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be somewhere that felt honest." "Yes, this feels honest to me," she said. "Whatever this is. It feels like the most honest thing I've had in a long time." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it slowly, and she watched him do it with an expression of such open feeling that it cost him his usual careful composure entirely. "Grace," he said, "I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. Not because of the situation, not because of Voss or the water rights or any of the practical things. I'm not leaving because of you." "Is that a promise?" she said, and her voice was low and careful in the way of someone asking for something real. "Yes," he said, "it is." She leaned toward him and he met her, and the kiss was slow and quiet and completely unhurried. The kiss of two people who have been moving toward each other for a long time and have finally arrived. And when they separated, she was still holding his hand and neither of them moved away. What followed was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual and deeply satisfying deepening. They were together in the visible way that small towns require acknowledgement of, which meant that within 48 hours the entire population of Ridge Creek knew. And the responses ranged from Harriet Kell's barely contained delight to Sam Beaumont's straightforward approval, to the slightly resigned acceptance of at least 3 men in town who had carried quiet hopes about Grace, and understood now that those hopes were definitively closed. Yates moved out of the boarding house at the end of August and into a rented room above Odell's smithy, which was a practical arrangement because Frank Odell had been trying to find someone to take over the business for 2 years. He had no children and his wife had died 4 years earlier, and he was 61 years old and ready to think about a different pace of life. The conversation between them was direct and satisfying, the way conversations between honest men tend to be. "I'm not a blacksmith," Yates said. "You don't need to be. You need to be able to manage a shop and do basic work and recognize what requires actual expertise. I'll teach you what you need to know over the next year before I step fully back." "What about ownership?" "That depends on how things look in a year," Odell said. "But I like your chances." Yates learned the smithy work with the same focused patience he applied to everything practical. He was good with his hands and good with heat, and had a natural understanding of metal from years of work that had required him to maintain tools and weapons with no one else to rely on. He also had, it turned out, a talent for the business side of things, the ledgers and the ordering and the maintenance of good relationships with the ranching families who were the primary customers. Odell watched this with the satisfaction of a man who has found the right person for a situation he cares about. Through the autumn, Yates and Grace built the texture of a shared life with the careful attention of 2 people who know what it costs to get such things wrong. They had Sunday afternoons together as a regular fixture, often walking the valley or driving out to Beaumont's ranch when Sam invited them for dinner. They had evenings several times a week, either at her house or on the boarding house porch, or, as the weather cooled, in the small parlor of the house she had been steadily improving since Thomas's time. They talked about everything, the daily texture of their separate work days and the larger questions of what they wanted their lives to contain, and the past that had shaped them and the future that was becoming, gradually, something they referenced together rather than separately. He kissed her on the porch of her house in the blue September dusk, and she kissed him back with a thoroughness that told him she had stopped managing her feelings with the carefulness she had maintained through the summer. She held onto his coat lapels and rested her forehead against his jaw and said, "I didn't think I was going to do this again." Get kissed on a porch, she laughed, which was its own kind of gift. Fall in love on a porch or anywhere. He pulled back enough to see her face. "Is that what this is?" She looked at him with the directness and the openness both, the combination that was uniquely hers. "Yes," she said, "that's what this is." "Good," he said, "because it's what this is for me too, in case there was any question." "There wasn't," she said. "I've known for a while." "How long?" She considered. "Longer than I was ready to admit to you. And now I'm ready to admit it." He stayed on the porch with her until the stars were well established and the air had gone from cool to genuinely cold. And when he finally walked back to the room above Odell's smithy, it was with the particular warm solidity of a man who has found his direction after a long time of being undirected. Autumn deepened, and the valley turned gold and amber, and the mornings got their edge of cold, and the baking smells from Grace's shop seemed more intense with the closed windows holding them in. Yates's work at the smithy had become genuinely useful, and Odell was spending more time at home and less time hovering over Yates's shoulder, which was its own form of endorsement. Roy Tanner, true to his word, had spent the fall months being the marshal the town needed him to be. He had paid off his debt to Voss's lawyer from the settlement money and was standing straighter. He and Yates had a functional relationship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what had happened in August, and this was sufficient. It was Harriet Kell who first said the thing that was in the air. She said it to Grace over tea in the bakery on a November morning, with the directness of a woman who has passed the age of indirection. "When is that young man going to ask you to marry him?" Grace had a complicated response to this which she kept largely internal. The external response was, "I wouldn't speculate about his timeline." "I would," Harriet said. "He's been in love with you since August, and he's a man who makes decisions when he knows his mind. So either he's waiting for the right moment or he's uncertain about your answer." Grace drank her coffee. "Are you uncertain about your answer?" Harriet asked. "No," Grace said. "I am not uncertain." "Then perhaps someone should let him know that." This conversation went largely as Harriet had calculated it would, in that Grace found a way to communicate without stating directly that the question, if asked, would be answered affirmatively. She did this by the simple expedient of telling Yates about the conversation, because she was not a person who managed information when the direct approach was available. He was quiet for a moment when she finished telling him. They were sitting in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening in November after dinner, with the lamp on the table between them and the wind against the windows. "Harriet Kell is a wise woman," he said. "She is," Grace agreed. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, with the directness that was his own quality answering hers, "I've been trying to find the right time, and I've been overthinking it, which is not my usual problem. The right time is now, Grace." He reached across and took both her hands. "I want to marry you. I want to be here in this town with you and build something that lasts and wake up in the same place for the rest of my life. That's not something I expected to want, and it's the truest thing I know right now." She looked at him across the lamp and said, "Yes. That's it." He said, "Just yes." "I've been thinking about it for 2 months," she said. "I don't need more words. Yes." He laughed, the laugh she had first heard in Harriet Kell's dining room and had collected ever since. He stood up and came around the table and pulled her up with him and held her in the lamplight. And she pressed her face into his neck, and the wind went on against the windows, and neither of them moved for a long time. They were married in the Ridge Creek Church in December of 1882, on a clear cold day when the mountains wore fresh snow, and the light was the particular brilliant white-blue of high-altitude winter. The minister was a serious man who had known Grace since her husband's death, and who looked at Yates with the careful assessment of someone who has watched a member of their community suffer, and wants assurance that the next chapter will be better. Yates met the look steadily and honestly, and the minister apparently found what he was looking for, because he smiled and moved on to the ceremony. Harriet Kell and Sam Beaumont and Frank Odell were there, and Roy Tanner and his wife Ellen, and most of the town was there because Grace was the kind of person whose happiness was also the community's happiness. Illy, the ranch hand from Beaumont's operation, played a fiddle with more enthusiasm than skill, which produced the kind of warmth that perfect music cannot. Grace wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool, which was practical for the season and also happened to be the color of her eyes. And when Yates saw her at the front of the church, he understood something that people talk about but that he had never expected to experience personally. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be in a way that is so clear it requires no analysis. He said his vows in a steady voice and meant every word. And when she said hers, her voice was steady too. And the minister pronounced them married, and Yates kissed her with a tenderness that made Harriet Kell produce a handkerchief from somewhere in the vicinity of her left sleeve. They had dinner at Beaumont's ranch afterward, the whole company of them around the long table in the warm house with the snow outside and the firelight inside. And Yates sat with his wife's hand in his under the table and listened to the conversation and laughter of the people around him, and felt something he had been missing since he was 16 years old, the feeling of being home. Frank Odell gave them a wedding present in the form of a formal letter of intent to transfer ownership of the smithy, contingent on a further 6 months of operation, which was his way of making the arrangement official without the sentimentality he was not naturally equipped to express. Yates received this with the seriousness it warranted and shook the old man's hand for a long time. They moved into Grace's house, which became their house without the process feeling like displacement, because the house had always been larger than one person needed, and Grace had always lived in it, as if she were expecting it to eventually be properly inhabited. Yates put his few possessions into the spare room she showed him, and they organized the space with the easy practicality of two people who understand each other's requirements. And by the end of the first week, it had settled into itself as a shared space in a way that felt entirely natural. Winter in the valley was quiet and cold and close, the way winters in small mountain communities are, and the closeness suited them. Yates spent the cold months learning the smithy's full range of work and developing his own approaches to the craft. Grace spent them baking and managing the bakery through the slow season and planning changes she had been wanting to make for 2 years. A larger oven, a dedicated space for pastry work, a window in the south wall that would improve the light in the morning. They spent the evenings together in the way of people who have discovered that being in the same room, doing separate quiet things, is itself a form of companionship. He read. She wrote letters to her family in Ohio, who had responded to news of her remarriage with cautious but genuine warmth. They talked about what they were reading and thinking. They sat by the fire when the nights were coldest. They learned the small rhythms and requirements of each other's daily existence. He taught her to play cards, which she was immediately better at than he was, attributing this to the fact that she had been reading customers' intentions for years, and that poker was simply a more formalized version of that. He was inclined to agree. She taught him to bake bread, which turned out to require a kind of attentiveness to process that he was naturally good at, and which produced the unexpected satisfaction of making something nourishing from basic materials. He made the rosemary sourdough on Sundays when they weren't open, and it became a private ritual, the two of them in the warm kitchen in the morning, the bread going in the oven while the sun came up. In the spring of 1883, Frank Odell signed over the smithy to Yates with the formal ceremony of a legal document and a handshake and a glass of whiskey in the office. And then he went to spend more of his time fishing in the creek and visiting with the older residents of the valley, which was how he had always imagined his later years and which suited him considerably. Yates Galloway, who had owned nothing except a horse and a gun for 12 years, stood in the smithy that was now his with a feeling that took him several minutes to identify as pride. The clean, uncomplicated pride of having built something real. It was in the spring also that Grace told him one evening over dinner, with the quiet directness she brought to everything, that they were expecting a child. He was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when something mattered very much. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "Better than fine. Why is that the first thing you ask? Because it's the most important thing." She looked at him with an expression that was soft and clear. "Yes," she said, "I know. I'm well and I'm glad, and I was wondering when you were going to say something about how you feel about it." "I feel," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I didn't know this was something I wanted until right now when it's real, and now I know it's something I've wanted without knowing it, and I don't have a better word for that than happy." "That's a good word," she said. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and put his hand against the side of her face, and she covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that in the kitchen of the house that was theirs, in the town that had become their home, while the spring evening went on outside, and the creek ran clear with snowmelt, and the mountains above the valley went from gold to pink to the deep, quiet blue of dusk. The summer of 1883 was warm and busy and good. The valley had recovered its equilibrium after Voss's departure, and the ranching families who had been under pressure were rebuilding. New families arrived from the east, attracted by the land and by the reputation of Ridge Creek as a stable community with good water and fair management, which was the kind of reputation that grew from the way a town chose to handle its hard moments. Grace kept the bakery running through her pregnancy with the efficiency that was her way, training a young woman named Dorothy, who was 17 and quick to learn, to handle the counter and the simpler baking tasks. This gave Grace the flexibility to work harder in the mornings and rest more in the afternoons, a distribution of energy that she had calculated carefully, and which Yates monitored with an attentiveness she found both endearing and occasionally excessive. "I am not made of glass," she told him one August evening when he suggested she sit down for the third time in an hour. "I know that," he said. "You are possibly the least glass-like person I've ever met. Then stop looking at me like I'm going to shatter." "I'll stop when I stop worrying," he said, "which might take a while." She relented, because the worry was genuine and not controlling, and because the particular quality of his attention, the way he noticed things before she mentioned them, had been part of what she had fallen in love with, and it was not reasonable to only want it when it was convenient. Their son was born in October of 1883, in the house on the quiet street behind Maine, in the presence of the doctor whose name was Elliot Marsh, and who was one of the better physicians Yates had encountered in his travels. The birth was hard in the way first births tend to be hard, and the hours of it were among the most difficult of Yates's life, standing outside the door in the way the times required, while inside Grace was doing the most demanding work a person can do. When Marsh finally opened the door and told him everything had gone well, that Grace was tired but fine and the baby was healthy, Yates sat down on the bench in the hallway with his hands on his knees and breathed in a way that was not quite crying but required all the same effort. The baby was a boy. They named him James, after Grace's father. James Galloway had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined expression, and the particular quality of new infants everywhere of making the world seem simultaneously very large and very concentrated. Yates held him in the lamplight of the bedroom, careful with the instinctive care of someone who has spent years working with things that require precision, and Grace watched from the pillow and said, "You look natural at this." "I don't feel natural at it," he said. "I feel terrified." "That's how you know you're doing it right," she said. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was the warmest winter Yates spent in his life. Not in temperature, but in the way a house feels when it contains a new person who requires everything, and in exchange makes ordinary days feel extraordinary. James was loud and vigorous and intensely interested in everything within reach, and the evenings by the fire now included a small person who regarded both his parents with an expression of profound importance. Harriet Kell, who had positioned herself as an unofficial grandmother from the first day James was brought home, came to sit with him on Wednesday afternoons so that Grace could have time at the bakery uninterrupted. Odell visited on Sundays and had a theory about early childhood development that was entirely incorrect but earnestly held. Sam Beaumont and his wife Clara came for dinner twice a month, and Clara and Grace had become genuine friends in the way that is possible when two honest women decide they like each other. Yates watched all of this with the continuous wonder of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for. He went to the smithy every morning and worked the metal and managed the accounts, and cultivated the relationships with the ranching community that were the business's foundation. He came home in the evenings to the smell of whatever Grace had thought to make for dinner, and the particular domestic noise of a house with a young child in it, and the warmth of it never became ordinary. In the spring of 1885, James turned a year and a half and walked unsteadily through the bakery while Grace supervised him with one eye and managed bread dough with both hands. And Dorothy, who was now 18 and had been promoted to full assistant baker, pretended not to notice when she prevented James from reaching a hot surface for the third time in a morning. The bakery had expanded. The new oven was in, and the south wall window and the pastry counter that Grace had planned for 3 years was now a reality. She had doubled her regular business and added a Thursday and Saturday pie service that had become something of an institution in the valley. She was, by any measure, exactly as successful as she had planned to be when she decided not to leave. In the summer of 1885, they learned they were expecting again. This news produced a response from Yates that was somewhat less stunned and somewhat more immediately joyful than the first time, evidence of a man who has learned that the things he was afraid of were not the things he needed to be afraid of. Grace had a daughter in February of 1886. They named her Clara, after Sam Beaumont's wife, who cried when she heard this with the emotional directness that had made her Grace's closest friend. Clara Galloway was quieter than her brother and more observant, a combination that Yates recognized with a fond recognition. She watched everything with enormous dark eyes that missed nothing, and she had her mother's hair and her mother's posture, even as an infant, straight-backed and serious. James, who had initially treated his sister with the skeptical wariness of a 2-year-old, confronted with a development he had not been consulted about, converted entirely within 2 weeks, and became a devoted and somewhat overbearing guardian who brought Clara rocks and sticks, and on one memorable occasion, a frog, all of which he presented as gifts of great value. Life in Ridge Creek in the middle 1880s had the quality of a place that had found its equilibrium. The town had grown without losing its character. New families had come and become part of the fabric. The water rights were legally protected, and the ranching families along the creek were stable and prosperous. Roy Tanner had become the marshal he had always intended to be, and his son, who was born the same year as James, would eventually take the job from him, which is the kind of continuity that healthy places produce. Yates had built the smithy into the most reliable operation in 3 counties, known for quality work and honest pricing, and the fact that the owner would tell you clearly when something needed doing and when it did not. He had hired an apprentice, a young man from one of the eastern farming families named Martin, who had the natural aptitude and the willingness to learn, and who Yates taught with the same patient thoroughness that Odell had shown him. He was 32 years old in 1885, and what he felt when he allowed himself to examine, it was a kind of deep, settled satisfaction that he had once considered either a myth or a reward for a kind of goodness he wasn't sure he possessed. He had not changed who he was. He was still quiet and watchful and capable of a stillness that made people slightly uneasy until they understood it was simply attention rather than judgment. He still wore the revolver, though the occasions that required its presence had become rare. He still had the 12 years of rough country living in his body in the way difficult experience tends to live, in the muscles and the reflexes, and the capacity to assess a situation in less time than it takes to describe the assessment. But these things existed now within a context that gave them different meaning. He was not moving anymore. He was not watching from a distance. He was standing in the middle of his own life with his boots on the same ground every morning, and his hands on work that mattered, and his heart in the keeping of a woman who understood him completely, and had chosen him fully, and who still, on ordinary weekday mornings when she handed him coffee across the bakery counter, could make him forget whatever he had been thinking about and focus entirely on her face. Grace at 30 was a woman of formidable competence and considerable joy, and the combination of these two things, which are not always found together, was the quality about her that he loved most. She had built what she intended to build. She had weathered what needed weathering. She had not allowed vase or circumstance or grief or the particular difficulties of a woman making her way in a time and place that did not always accommodate such independence to reduce the scope of what she believed herself capable of. She was also, he had discovered over 3 years of marriage, genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that revealed itself only to people she fully trusted. And he was aware of being in a small and specific category of people who got to hear her actually laugh. The real laugh, not the polite one she deployed in public. This felt like a privilege he never took for granted. They had arguments. These were direct and relatively brief, because both of them were people who said what they meant, and neither of them had much patience for sustained conflict when resolution was available. The arguments were mostly about practical things, the scope of improvements Grace wanted to make to the bakery versus the capital available for them. The question of whether James's habit of feeding his dinner to the neighbor's dog was something to address firmly or let run its course, the ongoing debate about whether to buy a second horse. They were never about fundamental things, because the fundamental things were settled, and had been settled since December of 1882, on a cold, clear afternoon in the Ridge Creek Church. There was an evening in the autumn of 1886, when Clara was 8 months old and James was nearly 3, when Yates came home from the smithy to find Grace standing at the kitchen window looking out at the late light on the mountains. James was asleep early for once, and Clara was in her cradle making the soft noises of a baby deciding whether to sleep. The kitchen smelled of the chicken stew Grace had made and the rosemary she grew in the window box. He came and stood beside her at the window, and she leaned into him without looking away from the view, and his arm went around her the way it went around her, the way that had become as natural as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "This," she said, gesturing not at anything specific but at everything. The mountains and the kitchen and the children sleeping and the town beyond the window and the accumulated weight and texture of the life they had built. "Good thoughts." She turned and looked at him. "The best thoughts," she said. "The kind I wasn't sure I was going to get to have again." He looked at her in the autumn light. This woman who had moved flour sacks by herself in the July heat, and told him directly that he was using loneliness as a personal narrative, and had fed the whole town for years before he arrived to notice any of it. He thought about the man who had ridden into Ridge Creek with a thrown shoe and a half-healed wound, and no intention of staying anywhere, and the particular combination of stubbornness and luck and something that might be called grace, in the oldest sense of the word, that had resulted in him standing here. He kissed her temple slowly. "I'm glad I didn't leave," he said. She laughed softly. "You tried hard enough." "Not that hard," he admitted. She turned fully toward him and put her hands on his chest in the way she had, and looked at him with the clear, open feeling that she no longer guarded, that she gave him fully and without reservation. "Thank you for staying," she said. "Thank you for making it impossible not to," he said. Clara made a decisive noise from the cradle, and they both looked over and then back at each other and laughed. The quiet, shared laughter of two people who have been interrupted by a child they love, which is one of the specific and irreplaceable sounds of a life going well. Years accumulated in the way years do when you are paying attention, each one distinct but part of a longer, continuous thing. James grew into a dark-eyed, seriously minded boy with a talent for mechanics that expressed itself first in taking things apart and eventually in understanding how to put them back together better than he found them. He spent his after-school hours in the smithy with Yates and Martin, learning the work with a natural aptitude that made Odell, who came to watch sometimes from his bench by the fire, nod with the satisfaction of a man whose legacy is in good hands. Clara grew into a girl of formidable observational powers, and a particular gift for language that revealed itself early and consistently. She read everything she could obtain and had opinions about all of it, and she delivered those opinions with her mother's directness and her father's careful timing, which was a combination that made adults in the town both charmed and slightly off balance. In 1888, Grace expanded the bakery into the adjacent building when it became available, creating the pastry and bread operation she had been designing in her mind for 6 years. She hired Dorothy full-time and brought on 2 additional workers, a young woman named Vera who had come west from Missouri, and a man named Franklin who had worked in a bakery in Kansas City, and brought techniques that added new dimensions to what Grace was already doing. The expanded bakery became a genuine center of the town's commercial and social life, the place where people gathered in the morning over coffee and plans, and in the afternoon over pie and news. Grace ran it with the authority of someone who has built something from nothing and knows exactly what it requires and what it can bear. She and Yates still had their Sunday morning ritual, the rosemary sourdough in the kitchen, just the 2 of them in the early hours before the house woke up. They had maintained this through every variation of their domestic life, through infants and the demands of the business and the ordinary erosions of time, because they understood it as essential in the way the best parts of a life are essential, not because they are grand, but because they are true. It was on one of these Sunday mornings in the fall of 1889 that Grace told him she thought they were expecting again. James was 5 and Clara was 3, and the house was already a full place, but he sat across from her at the kitchen table with flour on his hands from the bread he had been shaping and said, "A third. If the evidence is reliable," she said, "which it appears to be." He thought about it for a moment, the honest assessment of a man who takes things seriously. Then he said, "The house is too small." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that. We could add a room on the east side." "I've been drawing it," she said, and produced a paper from somewhere nearby that contained a careful sketch of the house with an addition on the east side, which she had clearly been working on for more than the 10 minutes since she had told him. He looked at the sketch and at her and said, "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, she said. "Grace, I was figuring out the room first." He looked at her with the particular exasperation and affection that she produced in him regularly and that he would not have traded for anything. "You knew for 3 weeks, and you were drawing plans for a house addition." "I was also thinking about names," she said, "in case that helps." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and across the table in the morning kitchen of their house with the bread in the oven and the children still asleep, and the autumn mountains outside the window. They were 2 people who had built something real together and knew it, and held it with the care that real things deserve. Their 3rd child was another son, born in the spring of 1890, when Colorado had been a state for 14 years, and the wild quality of the territory had settled into something more structured, without losing all of its original character. They named him Samuel, after Sam Beaumont, who had died the previous year after a long and decent life, and whose absence from the valley was genuinely felt by everyone who had known him. Samuel Galloway was a large baby who became a large child, fair-haired in a way that produced a certain amount of gentle confusion given the darkness of both his parents, until Grace's brother came to visit from Ohio, and everyone understood, because the family resemblance was exact. He was good-natured and physical, and interested in livestock from the earliest age he could express interest in anything, spending his first years trying to follow the work horses around the smithy yard with a determination that required significant supervision. The three children were distinct enough in character that they made an interesting household. James was serious and precise. Clara was analytical and voluble. Samuel was cheerful and physical, and convinced that any problem could be solved with sufficient enthusiasm. Together, they generated the specific domestic noise of a house with 3 children under 10, which Yates had never imagined himself capable of inhabiting, and which he had come to understand as the sound of his actual life, the life that had been waiting for him in a narrow Colorado valley while he moved through the world under the impression that he was going somewhere else. Yates Galloway, at 37, was a man who knew himself clearly, and who understood the difference between the life he had expected to have and the life he was living, and appreciated the gap between them as the best possible distance. He still woke early. He still moved through the world with the watchfulness of someone who had learned the hard way that attention is a form of respect for reality. He was still capable of the absolute stillness that had once been a survival mechanism, and was now simply a quality that made people feel understood in his presence. But the edges of him had changed. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a hand opens when it is no longer gripping something it is afraid to lose. He trusted his own happiness now in a way he had not known was possible, and he trusted the woman who had produced it with a depth and steadiness that was the foundation of everything else. Grace, at 34, was at the full height of what she had been building since she was a young woman with a dream and a capacity for hard work that exceeded most people's. The bakery was an institution. Her place in the community was as solid and deep as anything in the valley. She was happy, genuinely and comprehensively happy, in the way that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the confidence that you have the tools and the company to meet difficulty and come through it. She still made the rosemary sourdough. She still had the kitchen window that looked at the mountains. She still had the directness that had defined her from the beginning, the refusal to pretend that things were other than they were, the capacity to say what she meant with the confidence of someone who has spent enough years being honest to trust what honest delivers. On a Thursday evening in October of 1891, 9 years after a man with a thrown shoe had walked into Ridge Creek and been told by a woman behind a bakery counter that most men thought they didn't want rosemary sourdough, and then ate half a loaf at the counter, Yates came home from the smithy and found Grace standing in the front room of their house with a letter in her hand and an expression of surprised happiness. "My mother is coming to visit," she said, "for Christmas." He took a moment to process this. Grace's relationship with her family in Ohio had been warm and distant for years, maintained in letters, perpetually intended to be renewed in person, perpetually delayed by the logistics of distance and the demands of 2 lives that left little room for long trips. "For how long?" he said. "She says at least a month," Grace said. She looked at him with the particular mix of anticipation and slight apprehension of someone who has kept 2 parts of their life separate and is about to watch them meet. "I want her to know you," she said. "And the children, I want her to see this." He crossed the room and put his hands on her face, both of them, the way he did when he wanted her full attention for something he meant completely. "She's going to see exactly what it is," he said. which is that her daughter built something extraordinary and found someone to build it with who knows exactly how fortunate he is. Grace covered his hands with hers. That's a very good thing to say. It's the true thing. And so November of 1891 found them preparing for Christmas in the expanded house in the valley in Colorado. 3 children underfoot, and a business thriving, and a mother coming from Ohio to finally see with her own eyes the life that had been described in letters for years. Yates spent the evenings in November at the kitchen table with James, who was 7, and had developed a passion for drawing mechanical diagrams of the equipment at the smithy, while Clara supervised them both from her chair with her book, offering unsolicited commentary on their technique, and Samuel slept the deep sleep of a healthy 20-month-old who had exhausted himself completely during the day. Grace would come from the bakery in the evenings and stand in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment before anyone noticed her, just watching the 3 children and the man who was her husband and her companion and the partner in everything she had built. And what she felt in those moments was the particular fullness that comes when the life you wanted and the life you are living are the same thing. The mountains above the valley were cold and white and permanent. The creek ran clear as it had always run, protected now by laws that bore the fingerprints of everything that had happened in the summer of 1882. The water that fed the valley flowing freely for every family that depended on it. The smithy had a new sign that said Galloway and Son, which James had requested with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who has decided what he intends to become, and which Yates had accepted with the particular quiet gratitude of a man who understands the weight of being chosen. Ridge Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1891, was a place where a woman who had refused to sell an easement lived in the house she had kept, and the man who had refused to leave until he knew she would be taken care of had stayed forever, which was the only outcome that had ever made sense once you understood them, both. 2 stubborn and honest people who had recognized in each other the thing they had each, in their different ways, been moving toward all along. The story of how they got there was the story of a summer and a water right and a man named Drummond who had made a mistake and a town that had chosen itself. But the real story was simpler and more durable. It was the story of 2 people who told each other the truth and stayed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything,